The sun hasn't yet broken the ridgeline. The air is still. Around you the earth exhales, a breath that carries the iron smell of soil that hasn't seen rain in 3 months. Your boots crack through the crust of what was once productive land, now the color of old bone. The soil of this farm is dying. You can feel it. Not metaphorically, actually dying. And it's 1973. This is where our story begins. Not with hope, not with a vision of what could be, but here, in the broken silence of a New South Wales property that has been systematically stripped of everything that made it alive. 2,000 acres of eroded hillsides, pastures so degraded that native grasses haven't grown in decades, topsoil, that miraculous dark matter where life begins, washing into the creeks with every winter storm. The previous owners had worked this land the way most people worked Australian farms for 200 years, extraction before restoration, profit before ecology, a philosophy so deeply embedded in the colonial project that nobody really questioned it anymore. But in that moment, walking across those desiccated fields, David Brailsford did question it. He was 40 years old, a businessman, someone who understood balance sheets and risk, and he stood on his newly purchased property and made a decision that would take 50 years to fully understand the consequences of. He decided to stop fighting the land. Instead, he would listen to it. What he was proposing seemed impossible at the time, radical, the kind of thinking that got you dismissed at the local pub. He wanted to restore the farm not by industrial means, more chemicals, more fencing, more monoculture, but by studying what had been there before, by learning the grammar of the ecosystem itself, by asking, what wants to grow here? The philosophical question underlying everything he would do for the next half-century was deceptively simple. If we stop doing the things that destroy ecosystems, do ecosystems heal themselves, or is the damage permanent? In 1973, the scientific consensus was clear. The damage was permanent. Once a landscape was degraded to this degree, once the soil structure was compromised, once the native species were gone, you had perhaps a decade or two of futile effort before nature was lost forever. The land could only be stabilized through continued management, through human intervention. The natural world, according to the logic of the time, needed us to fix it. Brailsford didn't believe that, but belief without action is just sentiment. His first decision was structural. He cut off the inputs. No more chemical fertilizers, no more pesticides, no more aggressive clearing and replanting. He removed most of the exotic livestock, the sheep that had turned the hillsides to dust. Instead, he began the work of observation. He walked the boundaries of his property daily. He studied the creeks. He examined the remaining patches of native bush, little islands of resistance where the original ecosystem had survived in fragmented form. He talked to the old station hands who had worked the land for 50 years and still remembered, in fragments, what it had looked like in their grandfather's time. And he read everything he could find about Australian ecology, soil biology, the role of fungi in plant networks, the physics of water movement across land, the intricate relationships between native plants and the animals they had evolved to support. This was pre-internet. This required letters, journals, conversations with botanists and agronomists who thought he was slightly mad, but there was a method to what seemed like madness. Brailsford understood something, that ecology would eventually prove correct, that ecosystems are not just collections of species, but integrated wholes, living systems, systems with their own logic. And that logic could be learned. By the late 1970s, the first visible changes appeared, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would make headlines, but real. In the areas where he had stopped active management, where he had allowed the soil to rest, native species that hadn't been seen on the property in decades began to reappear. Small acacias, native grasses. The roots of these plants began the work of soil reconstruction, binding soil particles, creating the structure necessary for water retention and nutrient cycling. The mechanisms underlying this recovery are profound. Soil isn't inert matter, it's alive. A single gram of healthy soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. Fungi, bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, a universe of life invisible to the naked eye, but absolutely essential to everything that grows. When you stop poisoning that world, it regenerates with astonishing speed. Decades can feel like slow progress from a human perspective, but for soil biology, it is explosive recovery. But Brailsford didn't just wait for nature to do the work. He became a choreographer of recovery. In strategic locations, he began reintroducing native plants from seed, not planting monocultures, not imposing an artificial vision of what the landscape should be. Rather, he was carefully expanding the islands of native vegetation, creating corridors that would eventually allow animals to move across the landscape again. This required patience. Some seedlings failed. Some years the rainfall was insufficient. But the direction was always toward restoration, toward allowing the original ecosystem to reassert itself. The animals returned first as shadows, a bird species here, a small mammal there. Native species that had vanished in the 1950s suddenly appeared again because there was food, because there was habitat, because there were corridors of native vegetation connecting fragments that had been isolated for generations. Each returning species changed the ecology further. They dispersed seeds, they created new niches, they brought back the complexity that had been stripped away. By the early 1990s, something remarkable had become undeniable. The farm was not just degraded land that had been halted in its decline. It was actively becoming wild again. The creek that had run grey and silted from erosion was beginning to clear. Fish species that hadn't been seen in that watershed for 40 years reappeared. The water table, depleted from decades of intensive agriculture, began to rise. Native trees that were thought to be gone from the area entirely, trees that had required specific seed dispersers, specific ecological partnerships to survive, suddenly began appearing in unexpected places. This is where the story moves from personal redemption into ecological revelation. What Brailsford had done, almost by accident, was to prove something that conservation biology was only beginning to understand in the 1990s. Degraded land is not necessarily permanently broken. Ecosystems possess what we might call ecological memory, the genetic potential for recovery, the potential for wild nature to reassert itself if given even partial conditions to do so. The science behind this is intricate. Many Australian plant species have seeds that can remain viable in soil for decades, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. When you stop the practices that prevent germination, the constant disturbance, the herbicides, the altered fire regimes, these seeds wake up. Native animals that had survived in fragmented populations suddenly have corridors. Endangered species that researchers thought were regionally extinct begin to establish themselves again through natural dispersal and reproduction. The keystone species, the species whose presence disproportionately affects ecosystem function, began to return. A species of native bee that was essential for pollination. A ground-dwelling bird whose feeding behavior was crucial for seed dispersal and soil aeration. These returns cascaded through the ecosystem in ways that even Brailsford couldn't have predicted. By 2010, when Brailsford was in his late 70s, the property had been transformed, not into some primitive wilderness frozen in pre-colonial time, rather into a functional, dynamic ecosystem where human presence was minimal, where wild nature was reasserting its own logic. The recovery was incomplete. Complete restoration would take centuries as the original forest giants slowly matured and soil profiles regenerated to their original depth. But the direction was unmistakable. The biodiversity surveys conducted by outside researchers told a story that seemed almost unbelievable. Native plant species had increased from fewer than 30 recorded species to over 400. Mammals that had been extinct in the region for 50 years now had viable populations. Bird diversity had increased sixfold. The soil itself had fundamentally changed. Topsoil depth had increased measurably. Carbon sequestration had accelerated. And the biological activity in the soil was comparable to what it had been a century earlier. What made this transformation possible was a principle so simple that its power is often overlooked: rest. The land needed to rest. Just as an organism needs recovery time after injury, ecosystems need periods where the extractive pressure is removed, where human ambition is set aside, where we stop trying to force nature into service and instead allow nature to be itself. The philosophical implications of what happened on this Australian farm are profound. For the entire history of human settlement in Australia, the approach had been essentially one of warfare with the land. Indigenous peoples had shaped the landscape for 60,000 years through careful management, controlled burning, selective harvesting, deep knowledge of ecosystem dynamics, but the colonial approach had been to defeat the landscape, to bend it to human will through chemical and mechanical force. The implicit assumption was that nature was an antagonist, that it needed to be conquered. Brailsford's experiment, and it was genuinely experimental, based partly on intuition and partly on emerging ecological science, suggested something different, that nature was not an opponent, that ecosystems, when given the chance, would do the work of their own restoration. That human intervention was necessary, but not in the way it had been practiced, not through domination, but through careful attention, through strategic restraint. The farm today, now managed by a land trust that Brailsford established decades ago, has become something unexpected, a living laboratory where ecological recovery isn't theoretical anymore. It's observable, it's measurable, and it's beautiful in a way that transcends aesthetic appreciation. The native trees that Brailsford and his early collaborators planted in the 1980s are now mature. They provide the canopy structure that shade-dependent species require. The native understory is dense and complex. Walk through certain sections of the property now and you might forget you're standing on land that 50 years ago was dying from misuse. The air sounds different. There's birdsong, not occasional birdsong, constant, layered, the sonic signature of a functioning ecosystem. The soil, when you kneel down and examine it, tells its own story, dark, rich, alive. Organisms visible to the naked eye, beetles, worms, centipedes. The smell is the smell of fertility, the smell of something that is generating life rather than consuming it. But perhaps the deepest shift is one that Brailsford documented but couldn't fully measure. It's the return of complexity, of contingency, of the thousand small interactions that characterize a wild ecosystem. A plant thrives because a specific fungus has colonized its roots. That fungus thrives because a particular soil condition exists. That condition exists because the canopy structure allows specific light patterns. Those patterns support certain insect populations. Those insects feed particular bird species. It's a web of causality so intricate that understanding it fully would require lifetimes of study. And yet it emerges on its own. Once you stop actively preventing it, once you allow the logic of nature to resume its ancient conversation with itself. This brings us to a question that might echo in you long after this script ends. In a world where human impact is everywhere, where climate is shifting, where ecosystems are fragmented, where the pressure on wild places seems overwhelming, what does a single farm restored tell us? Is it a reason for hope or a reminder of how much has been lost? Perhaps it's both. The farm on which David Brailsford stood in 1973, surrounded by dying soil and silence, was not an isolated case. It was emblematic of the dominant approach to land use across the developed world. Thousands of properties, millions of acres, treated as production units rather than living systems. And yet, if restoration is possible on one scale, it's possible on another. The mechanisms don't change, they scale. The farm today contains not just native plants and animals, but also demonstrates something more subtle. It suggests that the relationship between humans and nature doesn't have to be one of extraction and control, that there's another way. A way based on observation rather than imposition, on partnership rather than domination, on the understanding that when we stop fighting the land, when we give it the conditions to be itself, it becomes abundantly generative. The land remembers, the soil remembers, the seeds remember, the animals remember. We as a species have only forgotten, and forgetting is reversible. The possibility of remembering, of learning again how to live with the land rather than against it, is written into the recovery of that Australian farm. It's written into the returning of the trees, into the sound of bird species that hadn't sung that land for generations, into the darkness of soil that is living again. That possibility, subtle and patient and absolutely real, might be the most radical statement that a single farm could make.